Welcome back to the Wolves and Moose of Royale. This is Lecture 9. And what we've been doing up until now is kind of making our way through several different methods of analysis to understand the population dynamics of the Wolves and Moose on Isle Royale. The first approach that we took was a historical analysis, historical narrative, I should say. The second approach that we took was a little bit more technical and quantitative. That was to look at the time series analysis of those trajectories for wolf and moose abundances. And then last lecture, we began with the third method of analyzing the wolves and moose of Isle Royale, and that is by looking at the mechanics of predation dynamics. And this lecture is basically part 2 in that exploration of the mechanics of predation. And so what we've been doing so far is to consider how it is that wolf predation can affect the population growth rate of the moose. And we've especially focused on that. And now what I want to do is shift questions and address a different topic. And this topic really is indeed quite abstract. And so we'll try to go through it a little bit slow and carefully. But what we will have to do is to digest a little bit of theory about population biology in general. Okay? And the theory starts with this idea that predation may stabilize or destabilize the fluctuations that occur in a prey population. And this word stability, it has kind of a technical meaning, and we'll go through that right now. Okay. First of all, I want to describe some theory that is not so much specific to predator-prey theory, but is instead a little bit more general. It applies to all population biology, even the population biology of just individual species that are not interacting in a predator-prey situation. And in this context of just any population, its fluctuations can be described as being unstable or stable, with respect to density dependence. And so what we see in this graph here are two graphs, both describing the same situation, but just using different perspectives to describe that situation. So on this axis right here, we have the density of some population. And on this axis right here, we have the growth rate of that population. And a real basic idea in population biology is that when density is low, growth rate should be relatively high. And when density is high, growth rate should be relatively low over here. And we see that working a little bit in this graph by the fact that there's a kind of a negative slope. Now this negative slope is kind of shallow. It's not a super steep negative slope, and for this reason we describe this as being weakly density dependent. The other thing that's important here is this red dot right here. What this red dot suggests is, well, it's the place at which the red line, which describes the behavior of the population, where that red line intersects this line representing zero growth. So over here we have positive growth, over here we have negative growth. And so what happens is this. Imagine that you have a population over here, a little bit above, a little bit more abundant than that red dot that we're looking at. Well, what will happen if the population is over here? Well, at this point, the growth rate is less than zero, so the population will shrink. The population will tend to move in this direction, just like this arrow is showing us. Okay, well, what happens with the different situation? Suppose the population is right here, less than this red dot right here. What happens then? Okay, well, if we're right here, the growth rate is positive. The population will tend to grow, so it will tend to move in this direction. And it will do so until it gets to this point. And so what happens is that, as these two arrows indicate, is that basically wherever you are along the x-axis of this graph right here, wherever you are, you will tend to come to this point. This is considered to be a stable equilibrium, and hence we say that this population has some kind of stability. And what happens with respect to population dynamics for this population is kind of illustrated, at least in a real simple sense, by this graph here. If the population starts off at really low abundance, now I should point out or just emphasize density is indicated by this vertical axis. And if this axis is measuring time, the population would start off low and then would increase until it reached this equilibrium. And then this dotted line right here represents this same red dot that's indicated down here. Okay? This is a situation for weak density dependence. There's another situation that would be referred to as strong density dependence. It's qualitatively the same ideas. There's a negative slope here. The population tends to increase in this sigmoid shape until it reaches its equilibrium on this lower graph. So qualitatively, it's the same behavior. But what's the main difference, and it is an important difference, is that here the slope is very, very steep. Because that slope is very, very steep, if the population is far from its equilibrium, it goes to its equilibrium rather rapidly. Okay? And so again, the way to kind of appreciate this is imagine now that you're perturbed a little bit from your equilibrium and you're shifted a little bit over to the right. Imagine that that happens. Well, now look at where the value, where that line is. Look at where the red line is in relationship to the y-axis. That's an extremely negative growth rate. So if you are a little bit above your equilibrium, right here, if you're a little bit above your equilibrium, and you have this very, very powerful negative growth rate, you will go back to that equilibrium very rapidly, very, very quickly. So one of the things that happens, again, to kind of compare and contrast these two situations, weak and strong density dependence, under weak density dependence, if you wander a little bit from your equilibrium, if you are perturbed a little bit from your equilibrium in either direction, you will tend to go back to that equilibrium. Okay, you'll tend to go back, but you're going to go back, maybe not so rapidly, a little bit slowly, which means you may not spend that much time at your equilibrium, but you'll tend to go there. And in this case here, if you wander from your equilibrium either to the right, either to the left or to the right, if you are perturbed from that by some sort of environmental stochastic event, a severe winter or something like that, or especially good food conditions or whatever it may be, you'll go back to that equilibrium rather rapidly. The other situation is called inverse density dependence. It's inverse density dependence because, well, first of all, all of these situations are density dependence in the sense that the x-axis is all referring to density. This is called inverse density dependence because now the slope of this line is going in the opposite direction. This has this unusual situation of whereby if you're perturbed from your equilibrium, well, what happens if you go a little bit above your equilibrium, the growth rate is positive, which means you're going to continue to go further from your equilibrium. And if you're over here and then got shifted to the left of your equilibrium, well, then, you might be right here. That would be a negative growth rate if we look over here. Okay, well, a negative growth rate means you're going to continue to shrink. And so what happens in terms of this lower graph is that imagine if the population starts off right here at some point in time at its equilibrium, and then if it gets perturbed just a little bit below its equilibrium, it's going to tend to get further and further from its equilibrium until possibly goes extinct. Or if you got perturbed above your equilibrium, you would get bigger and bigger and bigger. You would either, well, in theory, you would grow to infinity. We know that's not possible. So in other words, what would happen is eventually something else would happen that would basically make those dynamics kind of fall apart. Something else would go about. This is real basic population biology. It applies to all populations, at least the principles do. These equilibrium points that I described, I referred to them as equilibrium points, and they come in two kinds, stable and unstable. These are stable equilibria right here because you tend to go back towards them. This is an unstable equilibrium because if you go away from it, if you're perturbed from it, you tend to go further and further from it. And then the other thing that's important to know is that these equilibria points, these little dots, are sometimes, at least in the context of these graphs, referred to as the carrying capacity. And that's especially familiar when we see it on these graphs right here. The carrying capacity is basically this dotted line. On this graph, the carrying capacity is this point right here on the x-axis. Okay, so now what I want to do is take some of that same theory about density dependence, the same theory about equilibria and stability, and apply it to this particular case about predation dynamics. Okay? Now the first bit of theory that we need to address is illustrated by this graph here. And here I just have to ask you to take for granted some things that I'm gonna tell you, and then we'll weave it into these ideas about equilibria that we just spoke about. So the first thing to just take for granted, if you would, is the relationship that I'm showing you here, which just simply shows that there's a relationship, an expected relationship between prey density and predation growth rate. And that relationship has this hump-shaped curve. It's usually shifted over a little bit to the left so that it's not a symmetrical hump shape. It's kind of skewed so that the peak is a little bit left of center. Okay, we could do the math to show us that this is expected, but I'm not going to do that for us. We're just going to kind of take for granted that this is the case. And again, remember, predation rate is a special kind of mortality rate. It represents the proportion of moose that are lost each year, and we're saying that it depends on prey density. Now, another bit of theory to think about is illustrated by these red lines and text that I've just added. And so over here on the second y-axis, on the right-hand side, is prey recruitment. How many prey are added, say by calf production, for different densities of the moose population? And the basic idea here is that when prey density is relatively low, the population is able to kind of keep on producing prey. Oh my goodness, I noticed. These axes are labeled correctly. I thought for a moment this was incorrect, but it's just fine. What I was starting to say is that when prey density is relatively low over here on the left-hand side of the graph, then what happens is that prey population can just kind of keep on producing more and more calves, and the more prey there are, they can kind of keep on producing calves at the same rate, and that's why that line is flat. However, as prey density starts to get higher and higher, then eventually that prey recruitment will drop off, and then they just can't produce any more calves. They'll have reached their, if you like, their carrying capacity, at least with respect to calf production. Okay, so that's fine. The thing to appreciate on this graph are the two places where these lines intersect. These end up being the equilibria, like what we saw on those previous graphs, but instead now the equilibria are with respect to the places where additions to the population are balanced with losses to the population. Remember, predation rate, that black line, represents losses to the population. The red line represents additions to the population. So there, in real simple terms, there are three regions to the graph that are real important. In this region right here, the additions are in excess of the losses, so the population should grow. In this region right here, the losses are in excess of the additions. The losses are greater. The losses are right there. The additions are right here. The losses are in excess of the additions. The population should shrink within this region. And then in this region right here, once again, the additions to the population, the prey recruitment, exceeds the losses or the predation, so the population should grow in that region. And then, of course, at these spots right here, on these equilibria, they would balance one another, the additions and the losses. So if the population were right at this density here, it should stay there, because the losses and the additions balance one another. If the population happened to be right here, it should stay there at this density, because the losses and additions balance one another. I just mentioned there were three regions in the graph, and they can be divided right here and right here. But there's another way to see the whole thing, and that's to see that there are two regions in the graph. And those two regions in the graph will be divided by this line right here. And what they are representing is this region where predation rate is what we would say density dependent, and then this region right here where we would say predation is density where predation is inversely density dependent, this region right here. It's basically when the slope of that black line changes directions, that's when things are different. And so now what we can do is we can focus on these two equilibria a little bit more carefully. We'll just rather arbitrarily label this one equilibrium A. Okay? And so we'll ask these same kinds of questions that we asked before. What if prey density, for some reason, is perturbed to the right of equilibrium A? What if prey abundance is increased just a little bit by some stochastic factor? Maybe food was especially good that year, and so they increased a little bit. Well, what would happen next if the prey population went from here to right there? Okay? Well, I'm sorry, let me go back. What would happen if we were perturbed to this spot right here is, well, because the prey additions exceed the prey losses, the population will continue to move on to the right. So if you get perturbed from point A, you're going to kind of keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger until some other dynamic takes over and takes place. Well, what happens if you get perturbed to the left? You're right here at your equilibrium, and then something happens, a particularly severe winter, and the population, we'll say just by accident, gets bumped a little bit to the left. Well, what happens here? At this point, now the losses, which would be predation, exceed the gains due to reproduction. Looking at these two spots right here on the graph, if we draw this vertical line. So if the losses exceed the additions, then we just kind of keep on scooting further from the left. And so what happens is that point A represents an unstable equilibrium. If you're there, you will stay there, but if you get perturbed just a little bit, you get further and further and further. Okay, well, what happens? Let's just suppose that we get further and further to the left. Well, eventually, we'll get over into this region that's here on the left, in this region that I've highlighted in this light shade of green. And let's do the same analysis here. Let's imagine that you're at point B, and then ask, well, what happens if you were just a little ways from point B? Let's suppose right here at this spot. Well, what would happen at this region, once again, is that your losses exceed the additions, and so you will shrink. Well, you will shrink over into this left direction, and you will shrink until you reach this spot here, which is equilibrium point B, and then there you would stay. Okay? Well, what happens if you're just a little to the left of point B? Let's suppose you, for whatever reason, you started off right here. Something causes the population to be perturbed to the left. Well, then what happens here is that the additions to the population, the recruitment, that red line, right here, they exceed the losses, which are predation, which means the population will tend to shift to the right. And so what happens is that point B is a stable equilibrium. If you're perturbed from point B, you tend to go back to it. If you're perturbed from point A, you tend to go away from it. And so after all of that graphical analysis, the whole thing can be summarized like this. On the left, if you're in that green region, and so I went through kind of studying those graphs, looking at different points on the graph. Everything that I just described, I'm going to repeat now in words rather than by pointing at the graphs. If you found those previous graphs a little bit tough to digest, a little bit hard to wrap the mind around, think about what I'm about to tell you in words, and then go back to those graphs and study those graphs in the context of the words that I'm now about to share with you. And so, starting from the top and on the left, if you're in the green region, predation tends to increase with density. That means that we say that predation is density dependent. And because predation is density dependent, in other words, predation gets worse and worse as the prey abundance goes up and up. It means that the equilibria associated with this region is stable. The population will return to that equilibrium after any small perturbations, and as a result, predation is a stabilizing force in this left region of the graph. Okay? Now let's go to the other side of the graph. Onto that pink side, on the right-hand side. Everything is the opposite basically here. Here, predation tends to decrease with density, which means that we say that predation is inversely density dependent, which has the result of making that equilibrium associated with this region of the graph to be unstable. As a result, if the prey population is perturbed from its equilibrium, after this kind of small perturbation, it will not return to that equilibrium. It will either get bigger and bigger, or it will get smaller and smaller. And then what happens is that predation is a destabilizing force. The question for us, or I should say it a different way, what theory does for us is theory tells us that either of two very different cases can be possible. In other words, predation could be stabilizing, or predation could be destabilizing. Either case is possible. The task for us, and has been for many, many decades, is to figure out the empirical question, which is to say, in what region of this graph do real populations tend to spend time? And this is something that we don't have very good answers for, really. Again, Isle Royale provides some important insight. And so we're going to compare on the left-hand side what theory says is possible, highlighting the most salient point, which is that predation is stabilizing on the left-hand side and destabilizing on the right-hand side. And then for the Isle Royale data, we're going to basically look at the same kind of graph. We're going to look at a graph that shows prey abundance on the x-axis, predation rate on the y-axis, and we want to ask only one question when we look at this graph. Is predation basically decreasing with abundance? Or is it increasing with abundance? Or is it maybe, can we see that both are occurring? Which is the case, basically. This is the data. Moose abundance on the x-axis. Prey abundance on the y-axis. And what we see basically is just a single trend. A trend whereby predation tends to decrease with increasing prey abundance. Not only do we see what was a pretty sharp decline, especially for relatively low moose abundance, we also see that the R-squared is pretty high for one factor, moose abundance, to explain that much variation in predation rate, to explain half the variation in predation rate. That's pretty good. So what we can do next is take this graph that's on the right-hand side, the graph with the empirical data, and we can kind of superimpose on this graph. And what we basically see is that life on Isle Royale mostly exists in this pink region, in this region of destabilization. And what happens is that the stabilizing region is a region that corresponds with moose densities that are probably very, very low. It is possible that predation rate would do this, that it would increase maybe a little bit more, but then decrease sharply and come down to zero, that's what would happen at extremely low densities of moose, but we just don't see it that often. So, we know that the moose population fluctuates a great deal. We've seen that already throughout the course. Whenever we look at those time series of abundances for moose, we see that moose population fluctuates a great deal. We know that it's not particularly stable. And we now know that it looks like predation plays an important role in why it is that the moose population fluctuates so much. But we can still ask this question in a more quantitative way, and it would be this question is, if the population is the prey population is destabilized by predation, well, just how unstable is it? Well, that goes back to some of these original ideas that we had about the population being able to be characterized as being very stable, not very stable. Stable, not very stable, and just plain old unstable. These are kind of three possibilities. And these possibilities, ranging from very stable all the way to plain old unstable, they can all be characterized by these graphs that show abundance on this axis and growth rate on this axis. And what we want to do is, as always, compare these theoretical possibilities with what we see for the Isle Royale population. We'll do that with a graph that, once again, has moose abundance on this axis, moose growth rate on this axis, and what we see, in this case, the zero, the line dividing positive and negative numbers is going to be way up here. Okay, that's just because what we're going to see is there are some pretty severe negative numbers for the moose growth rate. We'll see that coming up right now. And so here's just the data. It's a bit of a mess, and it doesn't very neatly conform with any of these possibilities. Okay, well, let's just kind of look at it in bits and parts. For the moment, let's ignore this very important single data point down here in the lower right-hand corner. Let me describe that data point first, and then I'm going to ask that we ignore it for just a minute. This is a situation when moose abundance was extremely high. Almost 2,500 moose on Isle Royale. This was the year, if you recall from previous lectures, the year of 1995, going into the beginning part of the year 1996. that was the year of that very, not only very high moose densities, but that's also when there was that severe outbreak of ticks. Well, what happened that following year was the big moose crash. The big moose crash, of course, is associated with that very profound decline in moose abundance. Now that I've described that point, let's consider it for the moment, from at least a certain perspective, let's consider it an outlier, a data point that maybe doesn't represent normal situations. And so if that means we have the rest of the data points to consider. Well, what we have here is what looks like the best way to characterize that data is by this generally increasing line. Not necessarily a straight line, but generally increasing, which basically gives it this situation right here. That's the plain old unstable situation. The moose population is simply unstable. And again, we can kind of point to some specific spots. We can point to the spot where abundance right here, which is right around 1,000 animals, corresponds with the spot where the red line and the black line intersect. Remember, the black line is a zero growth rate. So this is when the moose population has a zero growth rate. It's at about 1,000 animals. But if the moose population gets perturbed a little bit from it, well, then the growth rate tends to be positive, which means that if you're above 1,000, you're going to tend to increase. But if you're below 1,000, you're going to tend to decrease. Well, remember what I said. I said this situation is maybe got some issues with it, because if as you increase in abundance, you tend to have a positive growth rate. Well, what happens then? What happens then is you would tend to grow to infinity unless something else takes over. Well, what might take over? Basically, a different set of dynamics. A set of dynamics that says, well, when things get so high in terms of abundance, then this trend is just going to fall apart and the population is going to decline. That's basically what we had over here. And so what might be the case, or I should say what is the case, and this is just a little bit technical, but we can just appreciate the qualitative patterns or the technical patterns, whichever your background allows you to appreciate best. If we fit a third-order polynomial to this data, if we fit a line to this data that allows for a couple of curves, then the best fitting line that we get is this one right here. If that business about third-order polynomials is a little tough to digest, basically just appreciate that the way that we can accommodate both this data here and this data here is by this curved line that we see. And then if we go a little bit further, and now we have to just make a supposition about what might be the case should moose abundance on Isle Royale ever get any lower than we've ever seen. If moose abundance ever gets into this region, maybe sometime in the future, then what's liable to happen is that this dotted line is what may very well characterize the relationship between growth rate over here and abundance in this low range. It would be this very strong density-dependent relationship. It would be this case right here, which basically matches this case right here. And so what you have is in the big picture going from very low numbers to very high numbers, you have this broad tendency for there to be a declining slope. You have this broad tendency to match this situation right here. This broad tendency is basically what prevents the moose population from growing to infinity or from going extinct. But except for those extreme conditions of just, persisting or going to infinity, except for that, when we're somewhere in the middle, which is most of the time, then you have this very unstable situation where basically predation is very likely the cause for the moose population to wander greatly between these two extremes of basically very low predation and very high predation. And that's why this system, or one of the ways of explaining why the system is so complicated. So basically, just to kind of recap all of that in the fewest amount of words, the moose population is unstable throughout most of its range of abundances. It is wolves, not winter severity, that seems to be a strong predictor of predation rate. And as a result, because of that, predation seems to be the cause underlying this important destabilizing force. And what happens I've just completed describing things scientifically. because of these scientific results, this is the kind of evidence that many people look to, and evidence like it, to make a judgment about whether things like predator control would be justified, whether it would be appropriate to say, kill predators in order to benefit the prey population. Again, this business about predator control is a management issue. It's also an important issue with respect to environmental ethics. We'll take up those topics in a different lecture. Now what I want to do is shift topics once again, but still focusing on this business of the mechanisms of predation. What I want to do now is take just a little bit of time and compare 3 different study areas. I want to compare Isle Royale National Park, Yellowstone National Park, and Banff National Park. These study areas are in 3 different areas of Isle Royale. Isle Royale right over here, of course. There's for this particular kind of analysis, we have about 38 years worth of data. It's characterized by a relatively simple food chain with primarily just wolves and moose. Yellowstone National Park is situated right here, northwest corner of Wyoming. For the kind of analysis I'm about to describe, there are 12 years worth of data, not as much data, but enough to kind of make some good comparisons with Isle Royale. They're a little bit different because this is a very complicated food web. It's primarily between wolves and elk rather than moose, but there are also bison, bears, cougars, and humans are also pretty important parts of this food web. So it's kind of a little bit complicated stuff. If we see differences between the 2 places, it might well be because of this complicated ecosystem. Banff is in the northern Rocky Mountains. It's in Canada. From Banff, there are about 19 years worth of data by which we can look at this system. Here, it is also primarily a wolf and elk system. Bears, cougars, and humans are also important parts of this system. Humans are an especially important component of this ecosystem. Humans really clobber both the elk populations and the wolf population. Really intensive harvesting by humans on both of those populations. And so again, what we want to do is we want to basically ask the lessons that we learn at Isle Royale. How do they compare when we expose data from Banff and Yellowstone to the same kinds of analysis? In particular, what I want to do is remind you of the analysis that we did in the previous lecture focusing on Isle Royale. And just to recap that idea, remember what we said is that we saw a pattern between predation rate and growth rate of the moose population. As predation rate increased, the prey population tended to have a declining growth rate. But we wanted to know, we recognized that was just a pattern, and we want to know what process is it that underlies that pattern. And we said there could be 2 possibilities. One is that maybe it's a genuine top-down process whereby wolves are controlling that pattern. But we also said that it's possible that, maybe severe winters are what underlie it, and severe winters could have 2 causes. One cause is to decline the prey growth rate, and because the prey is declining, because the prey are weakened by these severe winters, incidentally, predation rate will increase. In other words, wolves would just be killing these animals that are going to die anyways because of the severe winter. If this possibility is what's going on, then what we expected is that there would be a strong relationship between winter severity and predation rate. But in fact, what we see is only a relatively weak relationship here, a relatively strong relationship over here, which is this relationship between wolf density and predation rate, leading us to conclude that it's this top-down set of processes that explain the pattern that we see. What we want to do is see how Yellowstone and Banff compare to exactly these cases. So what I'm going to do for you in the next slide is show you the same 3 relationships, but presented in a slightly different way, and it's going to be this way. So for Isle Royale, this is this ultimate pattern between predation rate and prey growth rate. And then we have the 2 relationships that tell us about process. This is the one that tells us about the top-down process. This is the one that tells us about the abiotic process. And what we're going to do is, first of all, before we get into all the mechanism over here, let's just look at the patterns right here. First of all, with Banff, we see that a little bit less data, only about 20 years worth of data, but there still ends up being a significant decline in prey growth rate as you increase the predation rate. And that significant decline is indicated by that dotted line. I don't remember the p-value or the r-squared, but the p-value is significant. It's right around in the neighborhood of 0.05. The r-squared value is significant. It's not quite as high as what it was right here, 0.05. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, though. And then for Yellowstone, what we see, they have a bit fewer bits of fewer data. This is the zero growth line. That's also what's indicated here is the zero growth line in each of these three cases. What we see down here in Yellowstone is basically no significant relationship. There is not a tendency, not a statistically significant tendency for growth rate to decline with increasing predation rate. It may be just that there aren't enough data yet to support that possibility. Maybe that the possibility really exists, but it just takes more time to see it. Or it may be that Yellowstone is different and we just don't see that yet. Let's look at the underlying patterns now. The relationship between wolf density and predation rate for Banff is not significant. The relationship between winter severity and predation rates is also not significant. The p-value is very large. And so what we have for Banff is that, yes, there is a tendency for predation rate to decline with prey growth rate, just like Isle Royale. But instead of having some patterns to support, instead of having some processes that seem to support that process, like what we have in Isle Royale, here we have nothing. What's the explanation for this? Well, frankly, I don't actually understand. What it may be, however, though, is that these populations in Banff, both the wolf population and the elk populations, they're pretty small in terms of their overall abundance. And the other thing is that they are heavily influenced by people. Wolves are affecting both of these important processes. Wolves are affecting, importantly, what's happening in the wolf population, because that population of wolves is harvested so intensively. And humans are really pretty seriously affecting what's happening to the prey population. And what may be is it may be that this human effect is basically such a strong perturbation to the effect, to the system, such a strong perturbation to the system, that it's masking any possible top-down influences or any abiotic processes, that they're just obscured. We don't know, but that's what I'm guessing is the case. And then if we look down at Yellowstone, if we look at these same graphs for Yellowstone, what we see here, again, recall, there's no tendency for the prey population to decline with increasing predation rates. However, there is a strong tendency for predation rate to increase as wolf density increases. So this is a bit of a paradox. What I think we have going on here is that we can say, by comparing these two relationships, is we can say that, and this is a little bit ironic or a little bit nuanced, but we can say that wolf predation is definitely a top-down influence. Wolves are causing it to increase or decrease over time, but simply that predation rate doesn't have much of an impact on the prey population. In addition to predation being a strong top-down process, even though it doesn't have a strong effect, in addition to that, winter severity looks like it might be playing an important role too. There's a tendency for predation rate to increase with winter severity, though the R-squared value is not quite as high as the situation for wolf abundance, and that p-value is a little bit marginal. And a lot of the relationship is hinging on this one situation right here, where both winter severity was high and the predation rate was high. Again, this is a situation where I think more time will be required to continue watching the Yellowstone situation to see how that relationship kind of continues to unfold. Does it continue to strengthen and become a stronger and stronger relationship as we get more data, or does more data suggest the opposite? And so basically, if you like, we can describe these three systems by these three questions. And so we can say for Isle Royale, is prey growth rate associated with predation? The answer is yes. Does predation vary with predator abundance? The answer is yes, and it is the stronger relationship in relationship to this other question, which is, does predation vary with winter severity? And the answer is yes, but it's a weaker relationship compared to the relationship associated with wolves. So the answer is yes, yes, yes for Isle Royale. For Yellowstone, the answer is basically no, yes, yes. No, prey growth rate is not associated with predation rate. But yes, predation rate does fluctuate quite strongly with predator abundance. And yes, predation is associated with winter severity, but not quite as much as it is associated with predation. And finally, Banff is yes, no, and no. Yes, prey growth rate is associated with predation rate, but we don't have good ideas on what explains the fluctuations in predation rate. And so we have this broad question, which is, how does wolf predation affect prey dynamics? And the answer is, if you look at 3 different systems, you get 3 different answers. And so with that idea, we can return to just the outline of our broader themes, which was we have been focusing on population dynamics. We've explored 3 different ways to look at those population dynamics. This most recent way, which has taken us 2 lectures, the present lecture and then our previous lecture, has been about the mechanics of predation, to look at the very, very details of kill rate and to ask what causes kill rate to fluctuate over time, to ask what are the consequences of those fluctuations in kill rate over time. And then we looked at predation rate, kind of the flip side of kill rate, if you will. The prey's perspective on predation is the predation rate, and we asked what are the causes and consequences of fluctuation in predation rate. And in looking there, the most recent answer that we got to those questions are that it depends on the place that you're looking at. And so now that we've looked at the mechanics of predation, we can ask, and actually now that we've looked at these 3 different methods of analyzing population dynamics, we can say, well, what are the big lessons? And the big lessons, they're a little bit hard to put into such concrete words, but the first lesson has to do with just appreciating this question, which is a great question, and it's a question that's been with us for the entire history of ecology for, about 80 years now. It's this question, are prey populations, or how are prey populations influenced by their predators? Are they more influenced by top-down processes or bottom-up processes? And one of the things that we learned in answering this question is basically lots of complexity. The first thing is that we learned that predation involves these really complicated multi-causal interactions. Climate is involved. There end up being these 2 different perspectives, the prey's perspective and the predator's perspective. And because of these complexities, it turns out that we're not so good at predicting population dynamics. The other thing that we learned from all of these complexities, especially kind of pointing back and hearkening back to this first question, this question that's right here, is we learned that the answer to that question can be different depending on what part of the world you're in. The answer to this first question can be different depending on the period of time that you're looking at. Remember from a couple lectures ago, we looked at just the Isle Royale system, and for the first couple of decades of that system, it looked like it was a real strong top-down system, but then for the second couple of decades, it looked like the system was more influenced by abiotic components, especially climatic variation. And so these complexities make this answers to this question kind of complicated. We even, just to remind ourselves of some earlier points, pointed out that in some cases this question may not be worded specifically enough. It's worded right here in a real general way that gives us a flavor for the topic that we're interested in, but some of the reasons you get different answers to this question is that the question can sometimes be worded in different ways that give rise to different answers. Things like, is it the short-term fluctuations in prey abundance that we're interested in? That can give you one kind of an answer. Or is it more longer-term dynamics, overall average abundances of wolves or moose that we're interested in? If you're interested in that, you can then maybe, again, get different kinds of answers. And again, what this is all leading up into is two questions that are very, very important for environmental ethics. Really, at the end of the day, all of this science, the reason that it is important to the general public is because what we want to know is, does all of this scientific data justify thinking that predation is an important component of healthy ecosystems? If so, then that implies certain management, which would be the promotion of predation processes and the promotion of the conservation of wolf populations. Or does this scientific data maybe, at least on some occasions, or maybe even generally, justify controlling predators? Does it justify that the influence of predators are so important, and what it is that moose do for humans, basically there's something for us to hunt. For various reasons we hunt them. Sometimes it's for sustenance. Sometimes it's for recreation. Anyways, different reasons for hunting prey. Are those reasons for hunting prey important enough, and is the detriment that the wolves might have on our interest to hunt those prey justify basically killing predators so that we can have that benefit of the hunting? These are pretty opposing ideas, and they're both really important in our kind of general society when it comes to managing wolves in different parts of the world. And I've mentioned several times now, in a subsequent lecture, very likely the very next lecture, we're going to focus on this idea, this business about, should we be promoting wolves, or should we be trying to reduce their abundances? Anyways, that wraps up a pretty big chunk of one of the topics that we wanted to cover in this class, Wolves and Moose of Isle Royale, which is this business of the population biology of wolves and moose. After we talk about some of the management implications about this population biology, we're going to shift to other topics. We're going to look at the life history of moose, and we're also going to look at the ecosystem effects of these wolf and moose population dynamics. So we'll be spreading out into really different branches of ecology in some upcoming lectures. But in any event, this is a good stopping spot for today. And as always, thanks for your attention. And I look forward to sharing more information with you in our next lecture. Bye now.